it's 5:15. We're obviously 45 minutes late, and we've got another vote, I think, around 6 o'clock. The bells are going to start ringing 15, 20 minutes from now, something like that. I'm going to look for the committee to give me some latitude with the bells. And if we suspend at 5:45, go do the vote, and then come back, would that be acceptable to the committee? Is that a plan going forward? Okay. Yeah. It's been very difficult to get the witnesses here. They are now 45 minutes later than they thought they were going to be, and we do not.
Ms. Lambropoulos.
Ms. Lambropoulos, yes.
Bother people voting with the voting app in the room so that we save time?
Well, I don't think this party will agree to it, but. Like, I mean, we could save time, but still.
Okay, let me understand what you're.
So right now, my proposal is to suspend at 5:45. That allows people to vote at 6, and then the vote would take 10, 15 minutes. We get back here best we get back here is 25 after 6, and then we'd finish as much as we
If you're trying to, in advance, get unanimous consent to carry the meeting.
Well, I better
past
get
the
it
bell-
in advance
the bell-
because otherwise it's total chaos. We'll just.
No,
Yeah.
no, bells happen, and you ask, and
Yeah.
you get unanimous
Well,
consent to continue for 15.
I've got unanimous.
Yes, go ahead,
Yeah.
and
Okay, so-
we'll cross these bridges as we
We'll
come.
cross
Yeah.
the bridge at 5:45.
Yeah, please.
Okay, we're fine with that? All right. So, with that, I want to welcome Ms. Carr, Ms. Winger, and Ms. Henshaw to the meeting. I know we have a brilliant clerk here, and I'm sure he has briefed you. And I think a few of you have appeared before committees before, so you know the drill. So 5 minutes, and maybe we'll start with Ms. Carr and then go to Ms. Winger after that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, everybody, or good evening almost at this point. My name is Jennifer Carr, and I'm the proud president of the Professional Institute of the Public Service of Canada. Among the 75,000 members we represent almost 7,000 workers at the Department of National Defence. I myself am a proud defense team member for almost 2 decades. Working in an environmental engineering position, proudly contributing to the operational readiness and the safety and security of our troops. On behalf of our members, the Institute has been raising concerns about outsourcing for many years. Across the government, decades of unchecked spending on contracting out has created an army of consultants, not hired on merit, not subject to pay restraints or hiring rules, and not accountable to Canadians, working beside our public service workforce, but not operating by the same set of rules. A Carleton University analysis revealed that the government spent over $22 billion in contracting out in 2021-2022. Almost a third of that came from the Department of National Defence alone. Just one company received $750 million. And the fourth largest, Calian, received $250 million for delivering services that our public service employees could deliver. What do these eye-popping figures really mean? Contracting out leads to less value for money, less accountability, the loss of invaluable skills and expertise. Let's first talk about taxpayer money being wasted. Last year, we asked the Department of National Defence how much they spent contracting out work that could be done by our members of the public service. We've asked this question many times before, but we finally got an answer. DND's Chief Financial Officer said it was an estimated $5.1 billion last year. That's more than double what DND pays for its own public service employees. $5.1 billion on outsourced positions compared to $2.3 on in-house ones. That's grown beyond a shadow public service. We now have a giant vampire sucking billions of taxpayer dollars into the pockets of private companies. Then there is the tremendous loss of institutional knowledge. Skills and expertise vanish from the public service, increasing ongoing reliability on contractors. This impacts our operational capacity and the security of our execution. And I invite the committee to look at the roles private contractors have on our operations, on the safety of the workers and our national security. As public service professionals and members of the defense team, they take tremendous pride in their work in servicing the Canadian Forces. They can always be counted on to put the safety of members of the CAF first, always. Too often when hiring managers now prefer to hit the easy button and just contract at work, in the process, diversity and inclusion rules are thrown out the window, official languages requirements are disregarded, and often the contracts are then given to companies staffed by former D&D employees, fostering an environment where who you know is more important than what you know. And so we don't bring in new talent, and we lose touch with younger professionals, and we fail to renew. Retention failures lead to recruitment failures. It's like a snake eating its own tail. We have a government creating its own labor shortages. In closing, the evidence is clear. Decades of unbridled contracting out has meant higher costs and diminished services, but there is something that can be done. And we have suggestions to turn the political rhetoric into real change. First, stop making it easier to outsource than hire in-house. Apply diversity and inclusion rules and language requirements to contracting out, just as we do for internal hires. Reinvest in human resources. Make it faster, hiring faster and fairer and more efficient. Second, let's get serious about retaining our staff. If we start paying public service professionals the market rate, we will improve retention and save millions on juiced-up contracts to private companies. The government is currently paying these contracted employees market rates, plus up to 30% to a company, but only if they don't work for the federal public service. And that has to stop. It makes no sense. If we can match market rates, if we could repatriate the public service employees lost to private contractors. And thirdly, end the vicious cycle of a government creating its own labor shortages. Each of you at this table will face a 5-year lobbying ban when you enter public life. Why not institute similar rules for employees, leaving the Department of National Defense and jumping into outsourced positions? I know that there's plenty of blame to go around for how things got this bad. But on behalf of the public service employees we represent, I urge this committee to focus on solutions. Help us take the next step down this road towards a wholesale culture change we so desperately need. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Is Winger.
All right, well, thank you for the opportunity to appear today. I'm June Winger. I'm the National President for the Union National Defense Employees. Our union represents 20,000 civilian defense workers. Our members ensure that military operations are mission ready at all times and that military members have safe and secure places to live and work. Our members are experts who work on bases, in offices, in laboratories, warehouses, airports, garages. They provide support services so that military can continue to be agile and combat ready. I'm here today to discuss the problem of contracting out because this is a significant issue that's going on in the department. Through the exposure of the ArriveCan scandals, Canadians are now more than ever aware of the problem of contracting out. What we've seen over the years is that instead of staffing, D&D is relying on extensive and growing use of external private contractors and using layers upon layers of subcontracting in order to accomplish its mandate, just like the previous speaker was saying. Our union deals with the consequences of this every single day. We grapple with the understaffing, with the shoddy work that's being done by contractors, with health and safety risks, not just to our employees, but to the military members as well. And did I even mention the runaway costs yet? Like there seems to be countless serious examples that demonstrate how the contracting that's going on is not yielding good results for Canadians. But first, I'd like to take a moment to say a few words about the ongoing strike of our non-public funds workers that has been ongoing for 45 days today. Even though these members provide key support services to our military and their family members, they are managed as though they are external contractors. We repeatedly hear that these workers are not responsible for National Defense is, not responsible for these workers, and yet 40% of the funding that goes to CFMWS is paid by National Defense. They keep telling us that they're not public servants, but they are public servants. They're just Schedule 5 rather than 1. And when we go into negotiations, the employer keeps saying that they can't do anything without the approval of National Defense and Treasury Board. It doesn't make any sense. In fact, when we were in bargaining, at each bargaining unit, the CFMWS negotiator was telling the employees that they don't have the money to pay them properly. And the only way to get that money from National Defense is for them to go on strike. And so here we are on day 45. So while these members are on strike, they've been bringing in casuals, hiring people to come in and do the work, while this government has anti-scab legislation in front of them. And now we know that military members are also being assigned to do the very work of these strikers. It's clear that this arrangement with CFMWS doesn't make sense and it doesn't work. And it's important to remember that not only are a significant portion of these workers military spouses, but the core aim of their work is to provide support to the military and their families, the very support that the Ombudsman Gregory Lick referenced to this committee just days ago, that they're needed to address the retention issues in the Canadian Armed Forces. But what's going on with CFMWS is just the tip of the iceberg. The sheer volume of contracting out we are seeing, the unchecked contract amendments, extensions, ballooning costs, the lack of oversight, quality control, major errors, and total failures in certain contracts, they don't seem to indicate that contracting out is being used at all how it's been intended. In this committee, we've heard officials state that contracting out should only be used for temporary stopgap and for surge capacity. But in reality, that's not at all how D&D uses it. Okay. So I just want to bring to your attention, in October of 2018, ADM Review Services conducted an audit of all the facility maintenance contracts. And this audit concluded that the department was not completing a value for money analysis on the outsourcing it was doing. And the audit made key recommendations, including conducting a cost-benefit analysis and reporting on that cost and efficiency to the public service work versus outsourced work. It was clear that this was required, and yet we haven't seen it being done at all.
I don't wish to be harsh on the witnesses, especially in the circumstances where we've abused your time. But I have to hold people to the clock, unfortunately. Like Ms. Cramp-Nyman, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the witnesses for being here tonight and your patience and flexibility with the House and its schedule. That being said, let's jump right into it and suggest that the previous government, 2007-2015, National Defense directly issued a total of 70 sole source contracts. This government has issued 6,838. It's nearly a 100-fold increase in sole source contracts awarded by D&D directly. So, Ms. Carr, you expressed comments about raising concerns, alarming numbers, eye-popping figures. Could you elaborate more on how this trend is concerning to you? And could you perhaps shed some light on why a government should suddenly rely so heavily on sole source contracts?
Thank you for the question. And I like to say that this problem has been going back at least 2 decades. I started with the Department of Defense in 2006, and we have been on this issue. So this is not a partisan issue. This has become an over-reliance. What has happened is that when it becomes easier to ask a contract to amend their contract to provide a service, it becomes the go-to. It becomes the way that people are looking to stopgap measures to get the employees that they need to do the work that they need without having to go through all the hoops. One of the things that is important for this committee, the Department of National Defense, has 2 kind of separate agencies. One is a government-owned contractor operated, done by Weir Canada, called the Naval Engineering Test Establishment, and they also have a Schedule 5 Crown Corp called Defence Construction Canada. We have seen these separate agencies, at length arm agencies, taking more and more of our jobs. Defence Construction Canada was established in 1951. It was to do defence construction only, and they have ballooned to providing environmental services. That was my job when I was at the Department of Defense. They are doing project management now, and they are also doing contract management. So when we start seeing those jobs being outsourced, and again, it happens with all the major contracts as well, that they will add, somebody to do this work, and it's an amendment after amendment after amendment, ballooning the costs.
Perfect, thank you. Further, by far, the Department of National Defense issues the most procurement contracts. Since 2016, D&D has 135,759 such contracts. The next closest, perhaps fittingly, is PSPC at 53,425. So perhaps, Ms. Winger, you suggested that there's countless series of examples that are not yielding good results. So can you elaborate on why D&D insists on spending so much on consultants despite having so little to show for it?
Well, that's an excellent question. Thank you. But it's really puzzling, isn't it? It's almost impossible to figure out why, because it defies all logic. None of us would run our households this way, and yet for some reason national defense continues to. So a big challenge is there are a very, very small amount of SWE, the salary wage envelope, and there's a very convoluted, lengthy staffing process as well. And those 2 are hindrances when you have the ease of being able to have a great budget for O&M where you can just draw the money off to be able to do the contracts. And I think that it's been made so easy. Like I said, we had this review services audit that says that they're supposed to provide this analysis, but it's not being done. I can just point to Shearwater. The other day, they decided that they were going to do some maintenance on 3 military hangars, and they were contracting that work out. And when we asked them for the analysis that they did to do a cost-value benefit, they didn't know what we were talking about. So we described a business case. They had no idea. We actually provided them a business case, and management came back and said, "Oh, that's not our job." Well, if it's not their job, whose job is it?
Okay. Thank you. And also, you made reference to the Ombudsman earlier, and to follow up with that, the Procurement Ombudsman indicates that during the procurement practice review of the Department of National Defense, there was 40 randomly chosen contracts from 2019 to 2022 to review. And alarmingly, of the 40, 2 of them were not able to have performance reviews analysis done on them because D&D had lost the paperwork. So similarly, of the 36 files reviewed, D&D was unable to provide individual evaluation forms in 9 files, and in 6 of the files, the consensus evaluation was missing. So is it commonplace in your experience to have incomplete documentation on a quarter of its bids?
You know, it's a very unfortunate situation that we're in. The contracts inspectors are the very members that I represent, and they routinely come to me and tell me that they are overworked and undermanned, and it's just impossible to be able to keep up any of those inspections or oversight that they're required to do.
So incomplete documentation. Ms. Carr, would you want to?
Yeah, I think so. I can only go from my experience too. Some of that documentation is coming from the contractor, and there's no one to enforce to the contractor to bring those documents forward. You know how they spent their money. If that is part of the oversight that we're missing, lack of transparency, lack of oversight being done by contractors who are basically in charge of every aspect of what they are doing.
Excellent. Thank you.
Ms. Nyman, Mr. Collins, 6 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to both presidents and vice president. Mike, I worked for many years at the municipal level and would often meet with unions to talk about who owns the work in terms of what their members' expectations were. We oftentimes had to go through a collective bargaining process, and so it was important for me to understand the lines in the sand that they had in terms of who owns the work and where there was some discretion for the municipality to provide private services or contracted services. Can I ask you, respectively, for both unions, where do you draw the line in the sand in terms of what work belongs to your members and where there's some discretion for the government to contract out? Because, you know, I would say from the municipal sector, if we're building a bridge, we don't employ people who build bridges. We have engineers on staff, but they're not engineers who design bridges. And so we would have to just, by nature of the work that we were undertaking, we would have to contract almost all of that out except for the project management component. So all that being said, I'm wondering where your line in the sand is in terms of providing the government some discretion to naturally contract some work out, but in respecting the rights of that you've enjoyed for decades with your respective unions.
Thank you for the question. I think, the lines are very clear for me, which is we don't have experts who build planes. We don't have people who are designing of military equipment. So that is definitely something that is contracted out. But once it hits our base, once it hits our formation, it is our job and our responsibility to maintain that equipment so that we can provide a strong and secure, engaged defense posturing. We also need to clarify that, short-term help in the Department of Defense is never short-term. So when I talk about the snake eating its tail and the over-reliance, it has to do with the fact that at what point do we have an analysis to say this is a long-term need and we should bring this expertise in-house in order to fulfill that mandate and not to be over-reliant on contractors.
Just before we go to President Winger, can I ask what is short-term in your mind?
So again, short-term would be 2 years.
President Winger, with that same question.
I have to say I'm in agreement with Jennifer. I think that there certainly is an opportunity for contractors to work at National Defense. We do have some very specialized work, short-term specialized work that requires the expertise of a contractor, certainly. In my job at National Defense in the Counterterrorism Center, we worked with contractors all the time. But we still had our regular ongoing staff. When it's predictable, when you can see that it's going to be ongoing work, why wouldn't you build up that inside the public service? It just makes good sense. It's kind of hard to answer such a broad question when it's very situational.
For sure. When I started politics, it was in the mid-90s, and it was in the midst of the common sense revolution for those people who lived in the province of Ontario. That language is back again, of course, in a different form at a different level of government. And the mindset at the time, if you recall, was privatize everything the private sector knows best. And of course, that led to great disruption in the workforce. There was all kinds of protests at Queen's Park at the time, and it led to morale issues. That line of thought in terms of public-private partnerships where the be-all and end-all went to other levels of government, so federal government adopted that at the time as well as municipalities. And it caused tremendous harm in terms of morale, but it also hit us in terms of costs. And I think you've alluded to some of those issues today. And I would ask, I caught your note on the value for money audits that most would want to go through before deciding whether or not they were going to gravitate to the private sector. Better to know that it's cheaper and the work is going to be done in a way that conforms with all the policies that you have as an organization. Can you speak to some of the harms that occurs when you don't perform value for money audits first prior to contracting out, and some of the morale issues that your members face when those decisions are made without explanation?
So let's talk about morale, because you heard my numbers. You almost have a 60% contractor-run organization. We talk about, defense and its mandate. It needs to, be able to have operational readiness and be prepared at any point in time. I'm going to use an example of medical services. Our armed forces need to have, access to medical care. However, that in itself has been contracted out long-term to Calian. Those services that our members are relying on are less transparent. They are paying market rates to the contractors plus Calian the overhead, which makes our employees feel less valued. We talk about the pandemic. During the pandemic, our members received zero pandemic pay. Provinces and territories gave pandemic pay to frontline workers. However, Calian provided lots of bonuses to come and work for the Department of Defense during the pandemic, and also bonuses for working over Christmas and other holidays. When you talk about morale, basically the employer is saying, I value a contractor more than you as a public servant, and that has detrimental effects. And that is across the board in research, engineering, IT work. But I give you Calian as the biggest example.
Madame Normandine, 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup à l'ensemble des témoins pour votre...
Thank you very much. Thank you, witnesses, for being here today. I truly appreciate it. And I have to seize the opportunity that you've given me, Ms. Winger, to talk about the CFWMS. So we know that in St. John, kinesiologists earn far less, and they are understaffed by 48%. And the Canex stores, the salary conditions are very precarious, and we are not giving people full-time positions so that there is no need to give benefits to people who work there. And I think that, as you mentioned, Ms. Carr, it does create a shortage of labor internally, so that long term you have to contract out, even though in the current case we're not talking about subcontracting. But is that where it's going? The fact that these people are not being recognized as public servants. I was wondering what you had to say about that.
Defense team members are super proud of the work they do. They know their mission, and they know that a service member on the other side is counting on them.
Sorry, excuse me, Ms.
Sorry,
Clark.
you got bells?
When the bells
Yeah,
start
I thought you got
ringing,
bells.
technically I have to suspend unless
Okay.
I've got unanimous consent. It is 5:40, 15 minutes. You want 15 minutes? Is that fair? 15 minutes. So we'll suspend at 5:55, right? 5:55. Okay. Thank you. Please continue.
So I can continue. Thank you. I've lost my rhythm. At Defense, we always, have to pivot very quickly. I think we can bring that morale back, but it has to take a serious look at the staffing practices about, what is more important to the department? Is it to have, staff that are stable and secure and are valued for the work they do? Or is it really about, how easy it is to get somebody in? How easy it is to have a buddy and offer that job to a buddy because we have a contract that we can just instantly hire them. So I think we need to have a serious look at the morale of defense. 60% contracted out. We're basically being run by contractors.
Madame Winger, je ne sais pas si vous voulez ajouter.
Madam Winger, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, what's happening with our fitness trainers to the military is just outrageous. They're earning 62% less than the Schedule I fitness trainers. It's just bizarre. And the issue that causes them in relation to the morale is very difficult for them. It's hard for them to be able to keep up their morale and feel good about it. But if I could also draw on Jennifer's example of the Calian staff, I mean, we have Calian staff that are doing work that my members perform. they've been doing it for so long, they're paid far more than what the public servants are, and they're working side by side. And it becomes a massive challenge for these people. And as the department tries to get rid of the contract, they can't attract staff because they're so far behind market value. And what ends up happening is these people are at national defense 20, 30 years now. They're seen as employers. They come to the Public Service Appreciation Week barbecues. They come to the events. And in fact, they come to some of the sporting events on bases that public servants have to put in leave for, the contractors in there instead.
Merci beaucoup. Un autre dossier.
Thank you very much. Something else that I'd like to ask about is because I know that defense workers have looked at the contracts that are given in kitchens, and that's a problem at the Saint-Jean base. And that was a reason for contracting out in addition to having public service. So because if there was a surge of demand, we wanted to be able to provide services more flexibly. But over the years, with the studies that have been done, we've seen that there are no surges really, and that the work could be done by public servants. So has there been an analysis of the constancy of needs that has been carried out by the employer? And are there any figures that you have that would show that the needs could be covered by public servants, so there wouldn't be two categories of employees in one place?
100% that all of the work done in kitchens could be done by public servants. And in fact, on many bases they are. There's some poor management, poor planning that is preventing that from happening. And then they're reliant on groups such as DCC was recently trying to contract in kitchen workers onto bases now. Like, they've just spread right out. That work is predictable. Anybody can figure out what it's going to be. There's no reason why there would ever be an unpredictable surge at a kitchen. That work could and should definitely be done by public servants.
Merci beaucoup. Et rapidement, Madame Crump-Neumann a...
Thank you very much. We heard the question about the contracts and what these are, how many there are. Why are these contracts being given out? And do you think that the argument of national security is being given too much for certain contracts?
It's very interesting, because I would think the opposite would be true. I think that because of national defense security, you would want to have as much in-house as possible, that you would rely on public service professionals to provide those jobs, because once it's out in the contractor space, we can't control. They are not bound by values and ethics. They are not bound by internal financial administration rules. There are all these areas where a public servant can be more reliable for national security. And in fact, the more and more we rely on contractors, and the over-reliance means we're losing the institutional knowledge and skills to do it ourselves. And therefore, it says, oh, we can't do it. You certainly can do it. It just takes will, and it actually takes people listening to my consultation team president as they sit at the table day after day saying this job could be done by public service.
Normandine, Ms. Madsen, 6 minutes.
Thank you so much, and thank you for being here today. Ms. Carr, can you table with the committee the program to fail report, the report part 1, the real cost of outsourcing, and the report part 2, outsourcing and gender equity? And do you have any other reports or summaries that you feel would be helpful to this study?
Yeah, so for those of the committee, like I said, the Professional Institute has been looking at outsourcing for a long time, for over a decade, and so I will be honored to present those reports. I don't have any others, but any other internal studies that we do, we will be looking at doing a concentrated survey with the Department of National Defense at some time in the future.
Okay. Ms. Winger, can you table the Uncover the Cost report with the committee, and do you have other reports that would be helpful for this study?
I can certainly table the Uncover the Costs report, and I think we can put something else together to make sure that it's updated. Our contract out committee report is from 2020, so we have some updates that we can add.
Just out of curiosity, are they both bilingual, both reports? Okay, great. Thank you.
It's the public service, of course.
One does not assume.
Ms. Winger, I know that you didn't get a chance to talk as much in your introduction, as the chair likes to cut people off. But could you talk to us more about the logistics Unicorp contract and the experience D&D has had with this corporation?
Sure. So we've had a bit of challenges with logistics. Logistics has recently taken on a massive contract with National Defense. It's $3.7 billion over the next 20 years, and it will result in the elimination of 177 military clothing stores. So it'll be going from 240 down to 63. And that's significant. So D&D it's unclear how they're going to ensure that the contractor is providing the services that it's supposed to provide. And we're already seeing problems with it, and we're concerned about runaway costs already at this early on in the stage. There's already been issues with the previous contract that National Defense has with logistics, and yet despite this, they were awarded this 20-year contract, which gives them a substantial foothold without much motivation to increase their service or at least meet the actual terms of the contract. So I just had a meeting with members last weekend, and I recently learned about an issue with logistics where it took 5 months for them to fix, and it resulted in the recall of like 300 pairs of pants just due to a labeling issue. And so while the military store tried to get it corrected, they couldn't. And they kept bringing it up and over until finally it had to go to Ottawa just to get this corrected, with repeated interventions from management in Ottawa in order to force the company to fix its own error.
Was there any indication of what the cost of that would be?
The costs are nearly impossible to track. The department is not upfront with the costs, and whenever we try to trace those, we don't get any feedback on it.
And that's linked to the ADM checking and balancing and tracking of that. Okay. There was also an issue I heard about in terms of tour cleaning services. Could you talk about that contract, please?
This is a bit of a heartbreak. So if you recall, in Petawawa a few years ago, the GDI cleaners were on strike for 4 months. Finally, they got a contract, and then when the contract was reviewed again, GDI was not the winning bidder. What ended up happening was they brought in 3 contracts. Tour, a company named Tour, got 2 of them. Everything was going pretty well. It was 2 5-year contracts for nearly $8.5 million. But around January of last year, the employer stopped paying their employees on time and properly. Like, it's their collective agreement says electronic funds transfer, but they were getting checks. They were getting it paid to another employee and then deposited into their account. It was just bonkers. The employees weren't able to get cleaning equipment. Their cleaning supplies were getting drowned out from the providers there, weren't extending the credit anymore. They couldn't even use the company vehicles. They were stuck in garages that the company wasn't paying their bill for, ending up renting vehicles. It was just a nightmare. It came to a head around Christmas time. They just simply stopped paying the employees. I had a member call me up telling me she was a grandmother and she intended to have the family over for Christmas but couldn't afford groceries.
So obviously there are impacts, of course, on those direct employees. What are the impacts on our Canadian Armed Forces?
So then they were without cleaning services for about 3 weeks.
And when you say cleaning services, can you specify?
So their bathrooms weren't being cleaned, the offices weren't being cleaned, none of the eating areas, the living areas, none of this was being looked after. It was just increasingly getting worse and worse. The third contractor on base with the third contract was able to pinch hit, but these are 80 members, and they have 20 employees that are already fully employed doing the other cleaning. So now they were extending them to do the work of 100 people. And lots of those areas couldn't be done because they have security clearances that these employees simply didn't have. So places were just left with nothing. And yet, once again, military members were being asked to do the work, perform the work outside of what they're normally supposed to be doing.
Ms. Masson. That completes our first round. We have 17 minutes and 38 seconds before the next vote. I intended to get Mr. Kelly in and Mr. Fillmore in. And then that would take us to 7 minutes before. I'm going to work on the assumption and hope that we're prepared to vote with the app rather than go back to the House and vote. If there's any indication to the contrary, please let me know. But if I can get those two questions in, then we can suspend at that point, I think, and maybe get through this entire meeting. So, yeah. I have Kelly and then Fillmore. Oh, Fisher. That's a strange spelling for Fisher. Okay. Okay, so with that, Mr. Kelly, 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. So, Ms. Winger, you actually mentioned GC strategies specifically in your opening remarks, and the ongoing scandal over the ArriveCan app and the awarding of that contract. Are you aware that GC Strategy, the same company that is embroiled in the ArriveCan scandal, is also a significant Department of Defense contractor?
I'm not aware of that, but
Okay.
I'm not at all surprised either.
All right. So I wonder if any of our witnesses, for example, just a search of Open Government, I think, can reveal some of this information. There's some public information about this. GC Strategies is, for example, procurement number W768322R017 is a procurement that was sole sourced. It says it was for $38,000. We don't know what was done. Does anybody know anything about this this particular contract? Or another one for $99,553, dated July 30th, 31st, 2020. GC Strategies, $2,148,650.70. A contract, all we know, I've got a date of January 22nd, 2019, for professional services not otherwise specified. This one says it's competitively sourced. I have no idea what particular skill was involved there. Any of our witnesses know anything about these particular?
So I don't have any knowledge of them right now. We can certainly look into them, especially because they say they're professional services. That is something that we have always looked at from a contracting out perspective. That is where they engage in engineering services or IT work that could be done by our members. So we can take a look and see what we can find. But professional services is something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, GC is not the only one. I know you had mentioned it in your opening statement. We know that this is a controversial contractor because of the overrun. Well, overrun is not even the right word for it, but the what has happened with the ArriveCan app. But McKinsey is another one that we've talked about at this committee. Are you aware of the scope and scale of the McKinsey contracts with the government? For example, November 4th, $3 million contract for $3 million. Contract April 5th, 2022, $1,533,766. March 25th, another one for $935,000. Can you speak to the issues around transparency? We see these contracts. We don't know what they're for. Any comment?
So from a transparency perspective, of course, we want to make sure that we're getting value for taxpayer money. We'd have to take a look at them. But from the GC strategies and then McKinsey, those aren't really big on our radar. We have other really big players like Calian and TELUS and some others that are taking major amounts away from the government. We need to make sure that all contracting that is done on behalf of the government is done in a way that is transparent and accountable, and make sure that we have value for taxpayer money.
Right. We talk about you spoke of shoddy work. You spoke of, in fact, I think it was Ms. Winger. You talked about failure, complete failure, I guess, of the contract. I'm not sure what you meant, but do you have some examples you could give us on these consulting contracts that, under this government, have ballooned, as Ms. Kramp-Nyman had said in her opening statement?
So I guess that's a catch, isn't it? We try to catch all of these, and they're nearly impossible to track because they're simply not being tracked. The oversight simply doesn't exist. And so that's nearly impossible for us. So I can't even talk really to give you a fair answer on these sort of contracts, because my members are dealing with what they actually see, that tangible work that's being done right at the department that I can more speak to. But these other contracts, or even most contracts, we ATIP the heck out of national defense, and we get very little back. And when it does come back, much later, it's all redacted. It's nearly impossible to make head or tail out of it. And when we ask the department for it, we get very little from them.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. I know, and it was so fascinating asking these people questions they can't possibly answer. Mr. Fisher, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. And again, as Ms. Kramp-Nyman said, thank you for your patience when what happens in the House happens in the House, and it certainly impacts committee. I represent the riding of Dartmouth-Cole Harbour in Nova Scotia. We have a large group of both Canadian Armed Forces members and also a large group of DND employees. And I've heard from DND employees that they have concerns regarding contracting out, and in fact echoed some of the very same things that you said, Ms. Carr. So whether it's at Defence Research and Development Canada or whether it's on one of our bases, and Mr. Fillmore represents a base as well, we have so much expertise in-house. And I think that we can all agree that whenever possible, we need to invest in our people. We need to invest in our people so that we can continue to have and grow that expertise that you've spoken about in both the CAF and in the DND. So giving you, Ms. Carr, the bulk of my time, and I know you touched on some specific recommendations, but you only had 5 minutes. And getting things on the record once or twice in this committee is always helpful when we're studying things like this. So I would ask you what your specific recommendations or suggestions are to the government when considering the contracting and consulting services and other professional services, especially as currently all departments are conducting exercises to refocus spending.
So thank you actually for mentioning DRDC, the research arm, because something's happening very, very concerning to our members. We represent the research scientists. The government has started to rely on grants to do defense research, taking that dollars away from our research scientists and making them almost contract managers instead of doing the important research that is done on behalf of the Department of National Defense. Not only do we not, own the intellectual property for the research that they have done with our taxpayer money, if they come up with, I'm going to say a widget because I'm not a scientist, if they come up with something important, we're going to have to buy that back from them. And on top of that, they can sell that idea to another government. I don't think that is in the best interest of our national security. When we talk about contracting out again and the value for money, the the most concerning thing for me as a professional is the loss of institutional knowledge. This cannot be understated. When we start outsourcing and we start sending that expertise outside of house, we cannot bring it back. There's nobody to oversee that contract, that engineering contract, and make bear witness that there's something wrong with it, because we don't do any of that. So it's very, very simple, but it does take will. We have to bring it back in-house. We have to make a concerted effort to say, are these long-term positions, are these long-term interests, and bring them in. I know that I believe it was you had a comment about the relocation, how RCMP still does it in-house, and the Department of National Defense has left it outside. And the answer was that it would be too costly or it would be too hard. I don't think it would be. And in fact, I think the service that they would provide in-house would be better, and our members would be better served because they would be dealing with people who understand their daily life and their reality. Reality is that a federal public servant has pride in what they do. They are going to look for the root source and the root cause of something that has gone wrong, and they're going to provide a solution. The contractor is always going to give you a solution that relies on the contractor, thus, perpetuating the cycle.
That's. I'll give my last minute to Mr. Collins if he has a short snapper.
Very quickly, President Carr, you referenced an issue that's always been a pet peeve of mine. It's almost the bureaucratic buddy system where somebody retires. It's almost a Seinfeld episode. So somebody retires, we have a big going away party for them, 30 years of service, and then they're back 2 weeks later working on a contract basis. You highlighted that in terms of, but you didn't give a recommendation in terms of what we should consider as it relates to putting rules in place that prevents that from occurring. I see that as a morale issue. It prevents people within the organization from applying for the position that was made vacant by people who retire. So can you provide some assistance in terms of where we go with that issue if we're looking at recommendations to improve the system?
So again, it's very complex, but maybe what you have to look at is how easy it is to hire somebody. I would ask that maybe this committee think about talking to DCC or NDDN and asking them how they hire their people, because what happens is they know somebody and somebody is brought in under a NDDN contract to do that work. We have hiring rules. Make the contractors have those same rules. Make sure that they have to comply with diversity and equity, language requirements, security clearance. Make sure that that they can't just hop over and get a market rate. I represent professionals. A doctor should not have to jump over to Calian to get market rate, and then the government pays 30% on top to a company. Pay your professionals a market rate. Don't make it easy for them to be hired by a contractor with the same skills, and pay them properly.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. 5 minutes and 10 seconds. I don't think we should engage in the next round of questions with Ms. Normandine and Ms. Matheson unless they feel inclined to do so. We really, I think, should suspend at this point. You think they should go ask quickly?
Yeah, 2 minutes.
Okay. If you're comfortable with 2.5 minutes, then we'll do that. Then 2.5 minutes, Ms. Normandine.
Merci beaucoup. Peut-être une question.
Thank you very much. I have a question for Ms. Carr. So with the different things that seem paradoxical to me, I would like to hear your opinion. So the minister, when talking about the defense cuts, he said that we'll be cutting with regard to professional services and contracting. So the question is, are the resources there internally to do the work that private companies will no longer be getting? And it also seems that there has been an increase in the number of contracts, but also an increase in the size of the public service. So there's a bit of a paradox there, and perhaps you could make a comment that would help me understand what has been going on for 2 years.
When you say augmentation in the public service, I do think it's mostly at the executive level. It's at the higher levels. It's not at the working levels. So that's where we're seeing still a reliance on contracting out to perform that work, but an augmentation in the federal public service. We need to really dive into where the augmentations are happening. It's concerning to us.
Merci beaucoup. Et dans la même veine, là, sur la question de...
So, similar question. When it comes to public servants' capacity to do the work that has been contracted out in the past, I know that you mentioned it, but I'd like to hear more. What are the reasons that are given when there's a contract? What is the reason with regard to public servants' ability to do the work? Should there be a justification, a systematic one?
D&D and most federal departments has not invested in human resources. So you are leaving hiring up to engineers or IT workers, people who are already overworked, to rely on the staffing mechanisms. We need to make sure that we make it easier to hire and faster and more efficient, and you can't do that if you're doing it off the side of your desk. I am 100% sure that those jobs in the healthcare workers, Kellyanne, could be done by public service professionals if you paid them correctly and you put the effort into making those hirings happen.
I'm obliged to suspend. Colleagues, I think we can come back fairly smartly. We'll start out with Ms. Matheson for 2.5 minutes. We'll finish off this round, and then I propose to go for a third round and then see where we land at that point. We still have something in the order of an hour worth of time available to us. So with that, we're suspended till the vote. we've got the balance of this round to finish, which we'll start with Ms. Matheson, and then I have Ms. Gallant, and then Mr. Fillmore. That'll finish that round, and then I have bodies for the third round, but you can tell me which set of bodies you want going. So, with that, Ms. Matheson, 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This may be for both groups. So it was referred to, Ms. Winger, you referred to ADM review services and that horrible lack of transparency. You're unable to track that money and that value for money. You both spoke about that value for money analysis that you cannot do and cannot find. So interestingly, I asked the Deputy Minister about this at our committee, and he assured us that they have created processes to create a clear business case for each outsourcing decision. I wanted to ask, have you seen any business cases put forward since 2018?
So the processes that he might be referring to is the newest guideline from Treasury Board on contracting services. I've been very clear about our position on that. It looks like it's a gauntlet for somebody to get through before they can actually contract out. It doesn't put any oversight in the hands of the departments. It doesn't say, you know, when they should be looking and how they should be looking. It just talks about the steps and the processes. For me, you know, there needs to be clear rules and oversight. You need to look at, you know, can this job be done by a public servant, and not look at the easiest way to hire, to go to a contract. You should be able to say, you know, or there should be oversight that says, no, we don't believe that this should be done outside. I really would question, you know, the fact that it's just easier, and we need to stop that.
Ms. Winger.
Yeah, so I don't really believe that it is being done. And just the example that I gave you earlier about asking the management for that, it's simply not being done, and they don't see it as their role. Perhaps it might be done on a very much higher level, but then they wouldn't be able to apply the actual knowledge in making a fair determination. I think that it's very common for management to be telling us that they prefer to have public servants. They know that the work's going to be done quicker. They know that the work's going to be done better and less expensive, but it's simply a budgeting issue that doesn't allow them to do it. And so because of this budgeting issue where they feel that they don't have the salary wage envelope to allow for it and are stuck with their O&M budget, which is greater, as we spoke about earlier, they are left in the position that they have no other alternative but to contract out the work. And so then that analysis simply does not get performed because they feel that that's the only option.
May I add something to that? And I think it's very important for this committee to know. There is procedures for the department where they can convert operational maintenance budget into salary wage envelope. They just do not do it. They do not take the mechanisms and say that I'm going to convert this amount of money that's an O&M that is being spent on contractors and do the process that is available to them to convert it to salary wage envelopes. So again, when I hear them saying it's easier because it's O&M, they also have mechanisms to bring it back.
And that's because the HR issue.
Thank you,
Yes.
Ms. Matheson. I have Ms. Gallant.
Okay, I'd like to go back to research for a minute. So with research being contracted out, does the contractor deal with scientists from other countries as well? So is there cooperation with foreign scientists?
So all I can say is it's done independently. The two biggest contractors right now for the IDEAS program are Calian and Thales. And what they do and how they use that grant money is not for the department to say. We do not have any oversight, transparency, or an accountability. So I cannot say for sure.
Okay, so we saw with the level 4 laboratory in Winnipeg that they engage scientists who are actually from the Wuhan lab, which has a large defense component in it. So the same thing could be happening with our own defense research, is what you're telling me. Okay, so we've got a national security risk right there in our research. Secondly, Brookfield, they are doing the moving. Are you telling me that previously National Defense had the ability to move our people?
A long time ago, yes.
So Brookfield had a huge cyber attack, and it took in. They don't even know the level of intrusion at this point. But more importantly, aside from the ransom, they could be going after, drilling through, and trying to connect to our defense system. So now we've got another security issue, and then Defense Construction Canada. I was on base Petawawa not too long ago, and I saw signs on the residences where soldiers were supposed to be living, but were empty, that said Dexterra. So I looked up what Dexterra was, and it's another contracting company, and Dexterra hires more contractors. So we're not saving any money, but it's somehow easier. And back in up to 2015, we had 70 outsourced contracts, and that ballooned by 100% to 7,000. What made it easier at that juncture in time, at the end of 2015, for all these contracts to be more preferable to going through D&D itself?
So that's a complicated question. I could say, as the telephone chat goes on, so when somebody starts doing something and it becomes acceptable, then others start doing it. I would think that, again, the hiring practices and the changing of, leaving it to, under the Public Service Employment Act, leaving it to individual departments, giving the responsibility to managers to do the hiring would be a big contributing factor to the over-reliance on contracts.
Okay, so I had a medical person who said they had been approached by Calian, but they've heard about Calian and how Calian did something with Brookfield and then sliced all their wages. So the person's reticent to go through Calian. Is there a way that a medical professional could work for D&D or on base, for that matter, without going through a third party? Is there a direct hiring process that's still in existence?
Of course there is, but start paying them the market rate. Start, recognizing them for their professional services and treat them as professionals. Why they're going to Calian? I just talked about the pandemic. A government that had frontline workers refusing to pay pandemic pay to the frontline workers. That's just an example of disrespect. Add to that a Phoenix pay system. I'm sorry, but nursing and doctors and others, they need to get the pay on time correctly. So if you go to an agency and you do the same job, you get paid better, you get paid on time and properly every time, you get your overtime on the next paycheck, it is more and more attractive. Plus, I would say Calian is actively recruiting disgruntled or demoralized workers from our bases to come over, because they then get an additional 30% overhead from the government for doing absolutely nothing.
This was the exact opposite, because they would prefer that the government be signing their paychecks rather than having Calian take a slice of the action. So we've got a system that costs more by doing the contracting. We're losing institutional memory. It's a national security risk. And the jobs, especially through United National Defense Workers, they provide jobs to the wives and husbands of the people who are in the armed forces. And that's one of the major drawbacks of recruiting. There's nothing for the spouses to do. So all these things are speaking against the major 100% increase in contracting out. Why is it being done?
Thank you, Ms. Gallant. You've run past your time considerably. Mr. Fillmore.
Thank you very much, Mr.
Perfect
Chair.
timing, Mr. Fillmore.
Just in time delivery here. Excuse me, I had to go have a little coughing fit out there. Thank you very much for your work and for your time today, all of you. I've catching my voice a little bit here. So bear with me. Regularly over the last 9 years of me being in this job, I've met with your colleagues at PIPSC and at PSAC as well, about many issues, but most frequently about this issue of outsourcing. And it came to a head in 2018, I think, with some cleaners at CFB Greenwood going to lose their job, and we had a very successful intervention there, and were able to keep those jobs and cancel the proposed contract. So that was a very good day for everybody involved. All of that was part of dealing with with the fallout of the deficit reduction action plan that was put in place in 2012 by the former Conservative government. That I think 11,000 jobs were impacted, 2,300 of those in DND, and of course that was the loss of a great deal of institutional knowledge, and which then led to the need for outsourcing to some regard. And I don't need to dredge up history and all that, but that's partially why we're in this condition that we're in now. So I wondered if the one thing I wanted to understand was is it true that there are some services that do need to be contracted out? And I just want to make sure we know, with that big number, Ms. Carr, that you mentioned at the top, 5.1 billion, I think, make sure we're not including some of the necessary things in there. Can you just talk to that for a moment?
So again, it's hard for us to say what is necessary and not if we haven't done the pre-planning ahead of time. Our union has been very clear that you need to make sure that you look internally first. You bring groundskeepers, you bring some of the UNDI members into it. Let's talk about a recent contract or a recent report from Deloitte. We contracted a study, the Department of National Defense contracted a study to Deloitte for real property service, engineering services for major, bases. And lo and behold, that report said use contractors. That is work that my members do. And in fact, when my member raised the red flag about some of the things that were in this report, they were removed from the file. So I really have to question, if contractors are running the department, I will never be able to convince the department that, there's a need for public service. We need to make sure that we are providing value for taxpayer, that they have the same, values and ethics, that they are a part of the defense team, and that they are looking for solutions, not ways to line the pockets of their corporations.
Some of the things that I've heard from your members and PSAC members are that the hoped for savings don't materialize. You're trying, if the purpose of outsourcing is to save on pensions and maybe pay a lower hourly wage, that in the end the bump up to pay the corporations is you don't really get that back. Would you want to talk about that at all? The value for money.
So again, I question the fact that it would be less costly when you look at the fact that they're willing to pay a market rate to any member that can be contracted out, and then a 30% bump on top of that. What is the value to taxpayers? Again, we've lost the institutional knowledge, we've lost the in-house capacity, and now, we're actually, saying to the public servant who sits there at that job, you're not worth anything, you're not worth market rate, we'd rather, pay the contractor. And it is this vicious cycle that just continues, because then we have disgruntled workers who will jump ship, work for a contractor, will work for a DCC, a needy, and get paid the value that they are worth.
Do you feel that part of the solution to this problem that we're sitting with is retraining some of the skills we've lost?
100%. And sometimes I think, so the Institute is very clear about when we think contracting should happen. And like June said, it's when it's a short-term necessary need, surge capacity that we just can't manage, or that we don't have the skills. What happens in these contracts for defense is that we solely rely on the contractor for those skills. We don't say we want your skills, but we want you to teach a federal public service how to get those skills, how to uptrain those workers so that it is temporary in nature. And where I worked, we had a contractor who sat at the same desk for 15 years because he was a specialized skill. It can't be specialized if you're not training people and building them up to bring that capacity in-house.
Oh, that went fast. Thank you very much.
That completes our second round. So starting with the third round, I have Cramp Nyman, Lambropoulos, Normandy Matheson, Kelly, and Collins. So if there's any change from that, let me know. Ms. Cramp Nyman, you have 5 minutes.
Perfect. Thank you. So let's talk retention and recruitment. It's no secret that we have a diminished armed forces, and with that, there are consequences. It's no secret that recruitment has reached an all-time low, and it's at a critical level. So with regards to retention and recruitment, can you speak to how much work has been contracted out to civilians due to a shortage of enlisted personnel? And with that, because the CAF is perhaps a less desirable career than it once was, can either of you elaborate on that?
So that's a complicated question. If I could say that, the military has been doing, they've been doing stretch work for so long. Climate change, environmental disasters, all these other things that are not normal to their operational readiness or defense of the country. I believe the department has expressed that they don't have capacity to do that anymore. I don't.
If I may, just to perhaps give you some clearer direction on what I'm looking for, is the work being contracted out to civilians due to the shortage of personnel that we currently have?
So you use the word civilians. So I'm talking. Are you talking about public service employees?
Yes.
I don't believe so.
Okay.
I believe that any of that work is then being contracted out.
Okay. We'll pass the torch and move on to next question. Given the massive numbers of contracts procured by DND and the limited procurement staff we have, do you suggest it would be fair to say that procurement officers' ability to work on operational contracts like kit, oops-a-daisy, bear with me here, like kit is being sidelined by them handling so many service contracts? To give you some more opportunity to think, can D&D better streamline their procurement strategies to focus dollars, working hours, and other resources on things and services that directly benefit our armed force members instead of service contracts?
So the procurement process is onerous, but it is that way for a reason. It's to make sure that we have transparency, that there are checks and balances in place. That procurement process, when there are add-ons to the contract, they don't necessarily follow the same rigor and oversight. No, I don't think it's the procurement process that is the issue.
Okay. Ms. Winger, have you noticed any improvement or heard any particular testimony from any of your members that can speak to the cultural improvement at D&D?
Cultural improvement at D&D in regards, no, we haven't seen much change at all, really, to be quite frank, when you're talking about the culture, the professional culture change. Is that where you're going with that? It's been an ongoing challenge. I know that there's a lot of work that is being done by National Defense to work towards this, and yet the outcomes we're not seeing at our level anyways.
Okay, thank you. With regards to transparency, there's been a lot of conversation about transparency and the importance of transparency. Do you believe that there should be more transparency in the actual procurement process to better define what service contracts do so that Canadians can get a better idea of where their taxpayer dollars are going? Transparency is one thing to say, but how do we actually follow up with that and actually show it?
Yeah, definitely there needs to be more transparency. We were talking about those professional services. That's all it says is professional services. We can't dig into the data and say that those are engineering, those are IT workers. We need to have a little bit more transparency, especially when calling up something that is so broad as professional services.
Okay. So what steps do you see that you can do to ensure more confidence in this?
Thanks. I'd like to bring your attention to the Proactive Disclosure website. And years ago, on the Proactive website, we used to be able to go into and see a bid as well, and the buy and sell, and we would be able to see the work description, all of that detail, and that is no longer available on the Proactive Disclosure website. So that improvement alone.
Thank you.
I'm in Madame Lambropoulos. 5 minutes, please.
And thank you to our witnesses for being here to answer some of our questions today. Forgive me, it's been a long meeting, and I think that I'll be asking questions that haven't already been answered, but it is possible that there will be some overlap. You mentioned, Ms. Winger, that the review services audit had been done recently. Do you know when that was done? Because you did say that you haven't seen a change since. Just wondering timelines on when that happened.
Yeah, so the review services audit was performed, or at least their report was given in October of 2018. And then National Defense had agreed to accept the recommendations, and I think the analysis was supposed to begin by 2020. So we are 4 years into it now.
And when you had raised this recently to, I guess, the head of the department that you were working with, I think, I don't know exactly what the context was, but when you had raised it, they seemed to not know what audit that you were talking about. So would you say that there are communication issues between the different levels and that this could be hindering progress?
Absolutely. So at nearly every labor management meeting that our members have, and there's many throughout the department, they review the contract services and that they ask for the copy of the business case that was presented. And overwhelmingly, we are told there's no business case being done.
Thank you. Now, you've spoken about some of the challenges that the Union of National Defense Employees has been dealing with, including low wages of their members, low morale, layers upon layers of subcontracting rather than giving work to members. And you've been the VP and now you're the president of the organization. Can you tell me around how long you've been with the union?
I've been a member of the union since the late 90s.
Okay, so you have quite a history there, and so I'm wondering if you could tell us, in the time that you've been there, if things have gotten worse, if they've gotten better, if there have been waves, what has improved, if anything at all, and what, well, obviously you've been talking a lot about what hasn't, but has there been anything that's improved, and what do you think is causing the challenges to grow if they are growing?
I have 2 minutes. I'll be quick. I'm an Alberta talker. I'm slow. So I think that there have been some improvements. I think that we have a greater relationship with National Defense, the union does, than we ever had before. And although we don't always agree, we certainly are able to have those discussions and hear each other out. So I think that that's very worthwhile. I think that we've had a lot of challenges over the years, and certainly the 2012 layoffs that were referenced earlier did not do much to help things, and we still haven't recovered from that. And frankly, in my opinion, that's a large reason of why we have the contracting in today. When those 2012 layoffs happened, they were telling us that they were going to cut programs. Programs did not get cut. I work at Defense Research when I'm not in this position. I'm very much aware of how those programs get built, and people hold on to them, and it's their life work. They don't want to lose that. They want to keep going with it. And so we just continue to push and push and push, doing more with less and less and less, and that just builds to bringing in the contractors and leaving us in this situation. That SWE has not been increased to be able to get the work done, and instead we are paying phenomenally more amounts of money to those contractors instead of having it in the public service and keeping that that corporate knowledge that we're talking about.
Has the contracting gotten worse? Has it been more contracts than ever before, or is it pretty much at the same level? And when do you think that increase started happening?
Well, the contracting has definitely increased, and I think that it's primarily as a long-term result due to those cuts. We've never recovered from those.
Thank you.
Bravo. 2,5 minutes, Madame Normandine.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. So I would like to get a general comment on the duality between the public service and the private sector, because at times we might get the impression that you are promoting the public service because it's a public service, and that systematically anything that's in the private sector is bad. I have an example that I know for us. We have a private company that has expertise, that has been managing the college and for a long time. The service is good, it works well, and we are getting value for money there. But really, is there a duality between the public service and the private sector, or do you think it's more a question of transparency, or that it's impossible to get information from the private sector with regard to the number of complaints they might get or the way they treat their employees, perhaps with regard to the quality of services as well? I'd sort of like a general comment on those issues.
That it's not a good or bad, and I can't lump everything into one bucket. I would say, though, that it is hard for a public servant would be able to do the work when you ask them to do it. A contractor, you have to amend a contract. They are not going to work outside their contracts. So, for example, if you have a roads and greens kind of contract, and you wanted a tree cut and they didn't do tree cutting, you have to go and amend the contract. Where a groundskeeper, and I'm sorry, June, because I know that role, you can't just ask them to go and do that. So there is, yes, transparency, there's accountability, but there's also about level of service. If I need this done now, I can't wait to amend a contract, and that goes into some of the contractor employer relationships that we have with contractors. They actually sit at desks that employees do. They are getting orders or direction from public service, and that is not allowed to happen. It is against policy, but it still happens because they're trying to make things work.
Madame Normandine, 2.5 minutes, Ms. Manson.
So there was many conversations about the Defence Construction Canada with both of you today. Can you talk about the problems that you've seen in terms of the personal relationships between DCC and the contracting authorities on base, and the impact that has in terms of our military readiness?
Sure. So DCC is really embedded in national defense. Everybody sees them as almost another employee, and the challenge is the DCC staff have full access onto the bases, so they're walking around looking for work. They look for work, they determine what work's needed, they'll walk over to the RP Ops office, explain to them what they've noticed, and then give an offer to perform the work, like have the contract. And so it's the most bizarre thing that you've ever heard of. And I mean, you hear about people going door to door here offering to fix garages, and they always turn out to be some kind of sketch company. It reminds me very much of this.
Sorry, and so none of those contracts are, they're not looked for, they're just offering them and they're taken up on that?
For sure, and again, I can talk about my own experience when I worked at CFB Cold Lake. We use DCC as a hiring agency. Meaning that, if we needed a new staff member, we'll just ask DCC to fulfill that contract. That is not their role. DCC has letters patent that talks about construction. They are not to become environment officers. They're not to become administration staff, but they are being used in that way, and they won't say no because it's money in their pocket and work for them to continue for the over-reliance on them.
With the remaining time that I have left, we heard from Ms. Winger today just about the the treatment in terms of non-public funds workers, and I want to show my solidarity, of course, with those workers. They've been on strike for 45 days, I believe was said. So with that, I would like to give notice of the following motion, that given the 40% of Canadian Forces Morale and Welfare Services workers are members of a military family, given that the treatment of military families is a matter of national security, given that CFMWS workers in Kingston, Petawawa, Ottawa, Valcartier, Montreal, St. Jean, and Bagotville passed a 94% strike action mandate for fair wages, an equitable pay scale, and good security jobs. Given that these workers have been on strike since January 15th and the employer has refused to return to the negotiation table with a fair offer, and given that the CFMWS has chosen to invest in replacement labor, private security officers, and third-party negotiation consultants instead of providing a fair offer, therefore the committee express our solidarity with UNDE's non-public funds workers on strike and call on the employer to bargain in good faith.
Notice has been given, and we'll move on. We're fine with that. Mr. Kelly, 5 minutes.
Hey, thank you. I want to just return to a couple of points and make sure we've got responses clearly on the record. When Mrs. Gallant was talking about the risks to national security that go along with international research in particular. She talked about a few other things. I saw all three of you nodding vigorously, but a nod doesn't get us into the testimony. So I could maybe ask each of you to maybe spend just a quick few seconds and for the record, let us know if you agree with the concerns raised by Mrs. Gallant.
So for the record, anywhere that we use a contractor that we could use a federal public servant is a risk to national security. We don't have control of the information. The information is held by third parties, is at risk.
Mrs. Winger? Ms. Winger?
So just in light of what was just said, I can't agree that every international contractor could end up being a risk. We do a lot of work with international companies.
I don't think she said every one, and neither did I. But that international research cooperation by contractors that is a present risk or a possible risk.
It could be a risk.
All right, thank you. So the Ms. Kramp-Nyman talked about the contracting out as a substitute or an expedient when dealing with the recruitment and retention crisis that has reduced the capacity of the Canadian Armed Forces. So. On December 7th, the Deputy Minister said, I'd stress that we are in an environment where we are down in numbers on the military side. We're already asking civilians, where possible, to pick up some of that slack. So you would say, and I just want to make sure this is clear in our testimony, you believe that when he said civilians, you believe that this is contractors that are being given this additional capacity work, or that it hasn't increased on the civilian.
Yeah, so it might be taken out of context. When I talk about the One Defense Team motto, that means that whenever we need all hands on deck, that civilians will come in and help. I can't say without having the context in which he said whether or not they're using those jobs.
Okay, but I think her question was, are you seeing, I guess, the shift of work from the CAF members to the D&D civilian employees or contractors, and you think this might be going to contractors, or do you know?
I can't say.
Okay.
So we always work side by side with CAP members. That's a great deal of our work, and there is opportunity when there's going to be less CAP members available, that there's a potential that could be contracted out when they simply don't have enough people to do the work.
Okay. And in response to a question earlier, I don't remember which one it was, but I want to make sure I got this clearly, that it was Deloitte that had been given a consulting contract with the question, Should there be more consulting contracts? And they, in fact, affirmed that that would be a good thing. So that was Deloitte that did that for CAF?
Yes.
Okay, we've heard of other contractors being given that. I understand that I think McKinsey was tasked with the same thing with a similar response as well. Any more comments on this sort of type of expenditure by the Crown, whether there's value for service in something like that?
Well, this is certainly a case of the fox guarding the hen house. I mean, it's ridiculous to even ask this sort of thing from this group. And I think that their report very much illustrates their recommendation of why all this work should be contracted out. However, when we looked at the raw data that was shared with us from the department, it was their report was missing key information, only the things that fit their narrative, that drew the conclusion that they wanted it to be, which was supportive of the contracting out, was included in the report, and yet we saw all sorts of data that wasn't.
The current government is in the midst of cutting the defense budget by $1 billion. Do you think that there's $1 billion that where are these cuts going to go? Who is going to be affected by it? Are you concerned that your own members are at risk, given that the government has announced a $1 billion budget cut from the department?
Yeah, so 100%. We've been asking questions about who and where. We learned the lessons of the last deficit reduction action plan, and we want to make sure that operational services are maintained. The department has not come to the table with those jobs for us to do an analysis.
Just for my own clarification here, when the deputy minister says all hands on deck, is he referring to civilians who are employee civilians, or is he referring to employees who are contractors civilians, or is he referring to both?
So I can't say without the situation. Like I can say, like at the base, if we had a shortage or we had an incident and they were calling all hands on deck, that would mean that I, as an environment officer, could be helping stock shelves, or I could do other things. I need more context about what is being referred to be able to tell you. Obviously, the department does not or should not be directing contractors to do things that are outside of their contract. It does happen, and they do treat them like employees.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Collins, final 5 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. We haven't talked a lot about grievances tonight, and so you have collective agreements that has language in it, I'm assuming, that deals with some of the matters that you've brought to the table. Can I ask, in terms of the trends related to grievances as they relate to contracting out provisions?
Staffing is within the authority of the government and is not part of our contract, so we definitely sit at the labor management table, try and address this, but the department says it is within their sole prerogative.
Even when you have workplace issues, as you've described, in terms of people in the office, some of the inner
morale, the interplay, yes. Yeah.
Okay. The same would apply, President Winger, in your area?
Yes, we were not able to achieve the same contracting out language that PIPS was able to get. Simply, the government was not interested by the time we came to the bargaining. I think that they saw the challenge with that. So we don't even have the ability to grieve this, but it is something that is an ongoing discussion when we have our union management meetings.
In terms of the contracts that are let out, one of the issues that always bothered me was we're bound by a procurement process that says low bid oftentimes, and those that meet specs get the contract, and you kind of get what you pay for, is the old saying. But we'd find municipally over a period of time that there'd be certain chargebacks that then increase that contract value. I know that you've done some studies, I think maybe with both unions, in terms of showing that this is a growing problem. I think it's not unique to the federal level. It's something I think that happens at all three levels of government. Private sector looks for ways and means in which to bump the value of their contract, bump the value in terms of the revenues that come back to them in terms of the services that they're providing or the products that they're providing. Do you have recommendations that would help the committee address that issue that seems to be an area of concern for both unions?
So one of the solutions is to bring as much in-house as possible. We don't have to rely on adding more to contracts if we have the in-house services. One of the things that, especially when looking at contracts, big corporations look at the contracts and look for voids. They look for what you haven't put in the contract and know when they put their bid in that you haven't specifically specified, and will go after those extra charges. It is known. They have actual people who comb through government contracts to find those loopholes.
Yeah, and I totally agree. I think that is a significant issue that we have going on. To mind, I think of in Goose Bay, the base is being run by a contractor there out in Serco, and continuously they are having these add-ons where they think that they've got the contract nailed down, but then they find out that they have additional cost after additional costs. Just the snow removal, they ended up having to go to court over that and ended up losing, and now they're paying additional for the contractor.
Okay. You've talked about the apples to oranges comparison as it relates to the standards that the private sector is held to, and then your members, equity, diversity, and inclusion. I think you raised that. Can you expand upon that in terms of what you'd like to see written into contract language when it's been determined that those services then are offered by the private sector?
Yeah, 100%. I think if we are going to rely on contractors, that they should play by the same rules. I think that language requirements, one of the biggest barriers for some of our professional or a higher language is language. So if they can't find someone, they'll hire a contractor who is not bilingual, and therefore it's saying to I'm set to allow you to have a worker who can't work in both languages if they're contracted out. So apply the same rules. Actually give the public servant a fair market rate. If you are willing to pay a contractor, $10 more an hour, you should be able to pay the public service worker the same amount. So those are the key. You have to apply the same accountability, transparency rules to contracts.
President Wigger?
Yeah. You've taken the words right out of my mouth. I think that's perfect in a nutshell. And even, when we think about the Indigenous contracts, when they're supposed to have a amount of staff that are Indigenous, I mean, this was just in the news this week, right, where they were finding that wasn't even being monitored. The oversight doesn't exist. And frankly, I can think of contracts at National Defense where that's not being upheld.
Thank you, Mr. Collins, and that does bring our time together to an end. I just want to thank you for your flexibility and your patience with us. I also want to thank colleagues for their flexibility in terms of maximizing the time given the votes that were in front of us. So with that, thank you again, and the meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.